We are supposed to be live. I guess we'll find out momentarily if it went through. But do we see it live yet? No?
Nope, still says waiting for cryptocurrency certification consortium.
Says it's sending data and that we're live, but YouTube isn't showing it.
Oh, what? There we are.
Are we now? Okay, good.
Now we're live.
All right. Well, it's finally happened, everyone. We managed to go live. It's only like the 100th time that I've done this. Anyways, welcome. Thank you for joining. Sorry we're late. We had some technical difficulties, which I don't know what I can blame that on other than myself. So sorry about that. I'm Jessica Levesque. I'm C4's executive director. And now that we are live, we're going to be talking about Bitcoin acronyms and abbreviations, helping you to be able to speak Bitcoin in a professional setting or even just around the dinner table with your friends or family, because there's often terminology, words that are thrown around, and it's hard to keep up with them all. And that's what we're doing today. We're going to walk you through some of the acronyms and abbreviations and how they connect to our certified Bitcoin professional designation, which is why we have our CBP committee here with us today. So, Dirk, do you want to get us started with intros?
Yeah, I'm Dirk Anderson, and I'm a member of the Certified Bitcoin Professionals Committee here at C4. And I was just going to add to that the idea for this kind of came out of the fact that Rodney and I were at Blockchain Futurist a few weeks ago up in Toronto, and did a trivia session for folks, a live trivia session there, and there was definitely some confusion around some of the acronyms and abbreviations that were part of the trivia questions. So we thought it seemed like a good time to maybe go back and kind of back to basics and go through those.
And I can't say I blame anyone for being confused about any of it or not knowing the terms, because there are many and some of them even shift and change. So I can see why that would be the case. So Rodney, want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Rodney McInnes. I am the COO and AML Compliance Ninja at Outlier Compliance Group.
And Hunter.
Yes, great to be here. I am Hunter Albright. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Salt Lending and also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Colorado, where I have been teaching and talking about Bitcoin and blockchain. I think it was sort of going back to 2018. So excited to help cover off some of the basics today.
Awesome. Okay, so when we start talking about acronyms and abbreviations, we all know that it can get kind of dicey in terms of how detailed we go. So oftentimes when people are using abbreviations or acronyms, it's like kind of like the lingo, crypto lingo or whatever. And I think this is in every field that this exists. But when you're talking to somebody and they throw something out like P2P and you don't know if they need to go to the bathroom or if it's a crypto term, it's kind of, Rodney, that made sense.
Wow.
Absolutely. That's not where I would have went, but I'm with you.
But because some of the terminology is like, what is that? I'm confused. It's important to know what these are. And maybe you don't understand all of the information behind it or all the details that surround the term, but to at least have an idea of what that person is talking about so you can have a comfortable conversation, I think is really important. And it also will help you if you're working on becoming a certified Bitcoin professional, or perhaps you already are one, but there's constantly new acronyms and abbreviations. So let's get started with some of these. And I think a good place to start is to go and look at, if you look at C4's CBP, we have a study guide. It covers a number of different categories, and it starts with the history of money. And so a term that's not an abbreviation or an acronym, but it sounds weird. And if you haven't heard it before, I think it's a good way to understand. It's fiat. So what is fiat money, fiat currency? When I say fiat, what do I mean? Rodney?
Fiat money. Again, to kind of Jessica's point, didn't enter my vocabulary until I started learning about Bitcoin, and then it's used so often. But generally, fiat currency or fiat money is issued by a government or a territory or a country of some sort, it is typically legal tender. It's almost like a requirement that it is legal tender issued by that government. And it is like it's a designated currency by that government. So basically, a fiat currency could be, say, the US dollar.
Yeah, and it's not like I could pay my taxes in CAD. I live in the United States, so I would need to pay in USD instead of the Canadian dollar because you have to use your company or your country, your government's money in order to pay your taxes and things like that. So when we think back over kind of the history of money, the course that has taken us to where we are today, one of the reasons that Bitcoin wasn't something that was invented 100 years ago, well, aside from computers, but even 50 years ago, is because of a problem that is game theory, and it's something that was difficult to solve, and it's called the Byzantine generals problem. But people also like to throw around BGP. I think I might be sleep deprived because I was going to start rapping like who the BGP, but I'll just let Dirk take it over here and maybe explain what it means in a serious context.
No, please rap.
It would be way more entertaining than me explaining BGP.
I don't know. I think we're good at explaining this.
A new training session.
Right? Yeah, so BGP, and this is one of those acronyms that can be particularly confusing to some folks because if you come out of a world of computers and networking like me, BGP actually means something else. It's a border gateway protocol, and it's a routing protocol for routing packets on the internet. That's not what we're talking about. Like Jess said, we're talking about the Byzantine generals problem. And the Byzantine generals problem, in sum, is you have a whole bunch of generals surrounding a city and you're getting ready to invade, and you know that if you all attack at the same time, you're guaranteed to win. But how do you know when to attack? And how do you know if you're trying to coordinate that attack that the information that you're getting from all of the other generals about timing and everything is accurate, that no spies have infiltrated the network and are giving bad information to some of the generals so that they'll attack at the wrong time. And so this was one of the big issues with being able to try and decentralize something like currency, which is what Bitcoin did. In order to decentralize it, you have to have a way of ensuring that everybody's actually agreeing on the same thing. When you start talking about the ledger that tracks how much Bitcoin everybody has, how do you know that you can all trust that ledger? And so, yeah, when you see BGP in the context of cryptocurrencies, that's what it's referring to, the Byzantine generals problem, which, like Jess said, is basically just this game theory problem that Bitcoin solved through its application of encryption.
And the reason I think this is important is I remember being at a conference early on and joined a conversation, and they started talking about game theory and zero-sum games, and it was kind of something I wasn't that familiar with at the time. And then once I learned about the Byzantine generals problem and started kind of understanding why some of these problems can be theoretical, and that those theories can then help us create impactful changes because they guide us. It made a lot more sense to me then. So that was a great explanation, Dirk. And what I started off talking about at the very beginning was P2P. So why don't we explain what that means, Hunter?
Well, and I'm going to build on the Byzantine generals problem, right? Because really that ends up being a core element of why we can do and people trust peer-to-peer transactions with Bitcoin. And the same applies for machine-to-machine transactions. So you might also hear people talk about M2M, and both of which relate to the fact that we can exchange currency, exchange sort of value in the form of Bitcoin directly from one party to another. And it's one of the real enablers where we can start to think about a global system of economics, of transactions that is not tied to the domestic sort of fiat currencies that Rodney was mentioning earlier, and really allows us to transact with somebody on the other side of the world in a way where we can have trust in the transaction without necessarily having trust in the individual or the entity or the machine that is on the other side of the world. And so that becomes really enabling in terms of who you can do transactions with, and also the speed in which you can do transactions. And the byproduct of those two ends up being, in many times, a significant reduction of cost of those transactions in terms of processing.
Yeah, and to kind of tie all of this in together, before Bitcoin, there was not a way to do digital peer-to-peer transactions in a way that you were positive it would be trusted without a centralized third party, unless you were doing it, in person, but the digital side of things didn't exist. So that's why we talk about the history of money, we talk about how we got here. It was a lot of different things that had to come together for Bitcoin to start. And I think sometimes people think that Bitcoin just like came out of nowhere, but there's a lot of different things that had to come together in order for us to be where we are today, talking about Bitcoin, and for there to actually be a certification around it. So why don't we get into some of the basics about Bitcoin now that we've situated ourselves a little bit and how we got here. And let's talk about just some of the basic terms. So we hear BTC and sats. Why don't we get into what that means? If I say, hey, send me some sats, what am I talking about, Rodney?
That is the smallest unit of a Bitcoin, a Satoshi. There are 100 million Satoshis in each Bitcoin. So sat, Satoshi. There's some other terms that get thrown around, but that's the more common one. BTC is a kind of like the ticker symbol for Bitcoin, also referred to sometimes as XBT. Both of those are just the short term or shorthand for Bitcoin.
And you know what it made me think of the first time I heard, that's just my 2 sats. I feel like that's something that you'll probably hear if you haven't already. So when people say that's my 2 sats, it's like my 2 cents. And the first time I heard it, I was like, oh, I get it. But if you hear it now, like, it's something people say in the Bitcoin community. And so I think that's like one little way to feel like you're connected to other people who love this technology.
Yeah, and Jessica, just to add to that, I think the same thing is true for stacking sats. Whereas people accumulating and really trying to sort of accumulate the amount of Bitcoin, the amount of the asset that they are holding, which is also referred to as hodling, which is another sort of insider term, which all fits together in terms of probably a litany of acronyms that have used within the community. And actually, on this topic, one thing I think is timely to bring up, which I think is a dinner time conversation, but also fits within the acronyms, is the capitalization of Bitcoin. And I think this is an interesting one. And what is generally, there's not sort of a formal recognition, but when people are referring to the network of Bitcoin as a whole, that ends up being is sort of generally recommended as capitalized. And when you're referring to the Bitcoin that you're holding, like I have 5 Bitcoin, that would be a lowercase b. But again, not a hard and fast rule in terms of, I think, the editors of the world, but at least within the community, I think rules that people try to tend to adhere to when writing and talking about the asset and the network.
And probably worth just throwing in at this point as well that sats and satoshis come, of course, from the author of the Bitcoin white paper. So the anonymous author, man, woman, group of people that wrote the original Bitcoin white paper used the name Satoshi, and that's where the nomenclature for the division of Bitcoins comes from.
Yeah, and the Bitcoin network and Bitcoin, the currency, has led us into this incredible influx of different technological innovations using blockchain technology. And there's another term you might hear, which is DLT. And that ties into all of this as well, and kind of this bigger ecosystem. But I think it's something that we hear a lot in professional settings. So Hunter, will you explain what DLT is?
Sure. So DLT stands for Distributed Ledger Technology. And at the most basic core, it is a database. in terms of storage of information. But the unique application and design of this technology really allows for the security, especially when combined with the consensus protocol that is used within sort of the Bitcoin network. And I think one of the best ways it was ever explained to me is you can think about a distributed ledger as a whole bunch of homes in a neighborhood all having a copy of the same thing within a safe. And that in order for a thief to steal the value of whatever is in the safe would require them to break into every single home and either change the copy or take the copy in all the safes within a limited amount of time. And so when you think about the security of Bitcoin and the consensus algorithm, that's really what happens is somebody may be able to change one, but the likelihood of them being able to change enough or all within the window to sort of have a false or a fraudulent transaction confirmed is minuscule from a probability perspective. And so, digital ledger technology, again, is just this underlying database that helps support and secure the Bitcoin network. It does have higher costs, but it has shown over the length of the life of the Bitcoin network to have provided and continues to provide really high levels of security despite being tacked 24/7, in terms of this massive honeypot of value now that continues to increase in value. So it is standing and continues to stand the test of time.
And I will just add too that you will sometimes hear DLT or distributed ledger technology used simply just to refer to blockchains within communities that don't like to talk about blockchains. So state and local government a lot of time doesn't want to talk about blockchain because blockchain sounds like cryptocurrency, and that there's that can be kind of pejorative in some environments, and so they will talk about DLT as literally just another name for blockchain technology. So they'll be like, hey, we could actually use that technology. The concept is brilliant. We could use that to do something like, say, record deeds for houses or marriage licenses or whatever, but they don't want to call it blockchain, so they'll refer to it as DLT.
I think that's a really good point to mention that there are so many different ways to name terms that we use, or to change the conversation from something if it feels too political, or in different environments, which is why understanding all of the terminology is so important. I know where when somebody first said DLT, and I'd read and heard about distributed ledger technology, but had never heard it in a conversation just like thrown out there like that. And at that point, I knew all about Bitcoin. I understood how it worked, but I hadn't heard the abbreviation. And I remember being like, what is that? And then when I looked it up, I was like, oh, okay. But because we abbreviate things and do acronyms, whatever, it's hard to keep up with it. So I think that was a really good point. And when we talk about DLT and BTC and PTP, 2P, what we're really getting at is how we can use the Bitcoin network and what is the purpose of it. And it is to send money back and forth. And when we're using Bitcoin transactions, you'll often see it in writing as TX. So why don't we talk a little bit about TXs and UTXOs and TXIDs? We're not going to just throw them all at once. Let's go through them one at a time. So if we see TX, Rodney, do you want to walk us through these?
Sure, no problem. So as Jessica said, part of the kind of the core of the reason folks are interacting with the Bitcoin network is to move value around. That value being Bitcoin, and to do so, you're sending a transaction. So a TX is reference to the transaction. You also see TXN, TXNS as transactions, things like that. But basically, this is an instant where there is Bitcoin being updated between one wallet and another. And so, Hunter mentioned earlier that he has 5 Bitcoins, which I think is an odd thing to do on a live stream. But Hunter decided he's also going to send me some of those Bitcoins. And so he's going to send me some Bitcoins in a transaction, which we would call TX if we were writing this. So that is kind of the short form for that. It does have some others, but that's the most common one. As Jessica mentioned, there's a UTXO, or a unspent transaction output, which you will see the U and the O unspent and output, but the TX in the middle doesn't directly align, but that's where a transaction comes from. And so in this instance, a UTXO is kind of like the change that you receive. So Hunter's going to send me his 5 Bitcoins, all of it at once. Think of it as from a fiat currency perspective, as a $5 bill. So if Hunter only owed me $4.50, he would get 50 cents back in theory. So the UTXO is the unspent portion of that transaction, and you would receive 50% back, or 50 cents back, or a portion of what was sent back. These are kind of what make up the Bitcoin in your wallet, is the unspent portion of these. And they're extremely simple, but at the same time extremely complex. If you want to learn about UTXOs, we definitely talk about it, but I would advise go listen to Jameson Lopp speak on it, because he's probably one of the best at being able to explain UTXOs, also how to consolidate UTXOs and when not to consolidate UTXOs and things like that. So that can go down a massive rabbit hole. But like Dirk mentioned at the beginning, one of the things we noticed was the things people weren't understanding. In UTXO, one of the options was a very elaborate, complex sounding explanation that had the items UTXO in the explanation, but it was the most popular answer, which showed that was kind of misunderstood. Transaction ID, or TX ID, is simply, it's a hash, and it's kind of the unique identifier of that transaction. So every transaction that occurs on the Bitcoin network has a transaction ID, or a hash of that transaction. This is very important when it comes to mining, when it comes to building blockchain, when it comes to adding transactions. There's a whole bunch of elements of why that unique transaction ID is very important.
Yeah, and I would just say the place that you run into all 3 of these probably the most frequently is if you're looking at a blockchain explorer online, right? So if you go to a website that's all of the transactions that are going through the blockchain at any given time, all the movement of Bitcoin around, every one of those it'll show you what the transaction is, what it contained, how much money was moved, how much was sent back to a destination address in the UTXO, and the TX ID that Rodney was talking about. So that's where you're going to run into all 3 of those the most frequently.
And
I think there's an important, sorry, Jess, I think there's an important element with the UTXO, is it's not strictly referring to the change. It's basically a transaction that hasn't been spent. So even in my example, the 450 that I received would still technically be an UTXO. It's just now it's my UTXO. It's no longer Hunter's UTXO. And so all of the Bitcoin on the network effectively is a UTXO, because it is waiting to be spent. It is at its current resting point, unspent, waiting to be spent, ergo unspent transaction output.
yeah, and I think that just humble brag, our CBP course, I think, does a really good job explaining how unspent transactions work, because I do think it's kind of confusing when you start, wait, everything on the network is unspent? How does that work? But when you look at it, I think our videos do a good job explaining it. Also, I wanted to say, I totally missed when Hunter said whatever about having Bitcoin, which says a lot about you, Hunter, because for the most part, I'd probably what if somebody said that? But I know for a fact, because I've known you for so long, that it has got to be in the most secure location ever.
I don't think he actually said that he specifically had 5.
Oh,
I think he was making a hypothetical, like he kind of was like,
okay.
I have 5 Bitcoin that I.
So everybody's aware of that, but me. Got it. Check. Okay. Well, either way, I still think it's cool that everyone on this call would be so secure with what we have set up that it's would be a blip. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so did we talk about block explorers?
Not really, because
or transact. Will you quickly just explain that?
So yeah, I mean, we just kind of talked about them like as the online way of seeing what's going on the blockchain. Yeah.
Okay, and so everyone knows that you can just go onto a blockchain explorer and look up what the transaction is. So Bitcoin is not anonymous in the way that some people think. It is transparent. You can go and look at all of the recordings. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is BIPs, BIP. So a BIP is a Bitcoin Improvement Proposal. And I think one of the really, really cool things about Bitcoin is that it is a community of people that really care about the technology and work together. And anybody can make a recommendation for how they think the Bitcoin network could be, should be updated. And this is done through Bitcoin Improvement Proposals. And so anybody is able to go online and create a proposal. You can draft a BIP. You can get discussion and feedback by the community, and then it can be reviewed and perhaps accepted or not. And there's different types of BIPs, and we're not going to get into the weeds on that. But what's important about knowing what a BIP is knowing that it's something that comes from the community. There's not somebody at the top saying, check, this is what the change is going to be. It's a group of people that all come together, and these individuals decide collectively together what they think changes should be. And there's also soft forks, hard forks. We're not going to go into all of that now, but there are different ways to make changes. But one of the BIPs, so they're all numbered as they go up. So there's like,
yes. Real quickly before you get into examples, for another one of those, if for people who happen to be in like technology, and that includes computers, but also electrical engineering and some other technology areas, are familiar with the idea of an RFC, which is a request for comment paper, right? Very, very similar sort of thing to a BIP, right? It's somebody writes up a proposal, says, hey, I think this would be an improvement. And then the difference being there's not an authoritative body like IEEE or something like that makes the decision. It's the community, like Jess said, that makes the decision. But a BIP is very, very similar to something like an RFC.
Yeah, I really like that you pointed that out. Thank you.
And just to add to that quickly, I mean, the benefit about the BIPs, I mean, it's a slower process by design, right? It's one that has a tremendous amount of transparency, but also one that ensures that the community is brought along to anticipate and understand the changes well before they end up getting enacted to protect the network as a whole. So it has less agility compared to a startup, but the longer and longer and the more value we get in the network, there's benefit by having a structured process that is actually designed to be transparent and slow.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that just made me think of is this idea that just because things are being discussed and then reaching consensus doesn't actually mean that it's going to take forever or not be done well. Like there is a structure, a process, and we've seen many, many BIPs, hundreds of BIPs come into play because of this process. So obviously it's working. And one of the BIPs that it's important to know about is BIP 32. So it is all about hierarchical and deterministic wallets. So you might hear HD wallets, hierarchical deterministic wallets, and it basically is a gift to all of us so that when we are using our private keys, if we've got seed phrases, if we are working through this, we don't have to create a new private key for every single address, which is what used to need to happen. Now we can, it's like kind of, it not only is it derived from it, but there's like a string of additional addresses, infinite addresses actually, that can be created using the same key. And so that makes it a lot more user-friendly. Is there anything with that I missed, Dirk, that you wanted to point out? No? Okay. I didn't know it since I was getting into a little bit with the technical there. So, okay, let's talk about another BIP that has BIP 141 also has a term that is abbreviated and it's called segregated witness, but you'll hear people call it SegWit. And I think the most important takeaway about SegWit is just that it was a scalability change and it improved it changed the amount of data that can be added to a block so that less data is needed in the transaction so that more transactions can be added to a block because it segregated the witness data, which is why it's called SegWit. Anything else anyone wants to say on that?
Yeah, I would just say the other thing about SegWit, you'll hear like referred to a lot of times in reference specifically to addresses. So you'll hear like legacy address or SegWit address, and they're different ways of representing the same address on the blockchain. So, but where that'll come into play is like some exchanges will only work with SegWit addresses, right? If you want to send your crypto, you have to be sure and give them the SegWit address and not the legacy address to your wallet. So that's where you'll hear that that phrase used a lot of times.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. All right, so that covers the history of money we've done. We've talked about some of the Bitcoin basics terms that you'll probably hear. And now we're going to move into a little bit more technical section, which is cryptography. Now, don't run screaming. When you hear basic cryptography, I remember when I first was learning about this, I was like, this is not, I'm an English and Comm Studies major, and then once I kind of fell into it, I'm like, oh, this makes so much sense. It's the technology that underpins Bitcoin network. It's extremely interesting, and you don't need to know all of the weeds about it. So let's have Dirk, who I always call a cryptographer, and then he'll tell me he's not, explain some of the basics to you.
Yeah, no, thanks. And that's absolutely right. I'm not a cryptographer. I have dealt with applied cryptography for a lot of years in the field of information security, but I don't design cryptographic systems. But it is what fascinated me originally about Bitcoin, right? So I always like to point out the Bitcoin white paper over my shoulder here, and the fact that there was nothing fundamentally new in the white paper, right? What the white paper wasn't, it didn't invent something that like, hey, I always hesitate to say this. It absolutely invented something, right? It invented blockchains, but it didn't do it through like some like wild new concept. It took together and put together several existing technologies that were in use all over the place in a novel way to create that. So one of these that you'll hear referenced a lot of times is ECDSA. And that is EC on its own is elliptic curve. It's sometimes you'll hear ECC, which is elliptic curve cryptography. It's a method of doing cryptography. It's a series of algorithms for doing cryptographic processes. That is to encrypt and decrypt data. A lot of people, if you're used to doing like working with like online security, you'll be familiar with RSA cryptography or Diffie-Hellman handshakes, or like you may have heard some other things. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you've never like been interested in cryptography at all, or at least not since you were a kid making codes to pass secret messages to each other in school. But EC is elliptic curve. DSA is digital signature algorithm. So ECDSA is the algorithm that Bitcoin uses to sign transactions. So it's a public key, private key type of cryptography, which is to say there's one key that goes out to the world, everybody can see it, one key that's private that you keep to yourself. And then when I want to send 5 Bitcoin to Hunter, or he wants to send 5 Bitcoin to me, he will sign the message that says, hey, I'm sending these 5 Bitcoin to Dirk's address with his private key, and everybody in the world can use his public key to verify that he actually signed that, right? So that's how it works. It's the signing mechanism by which somebody actually authenticates that they intend to move this Bitcoin on the blockchain. It uses, like I said, elliptic curve cryptography. And in the case of this particular one, you'll sometimes see in things, and again, this is a lot of stuff that you don't really have to like know or get into the weeds on to be able to use Bitcoin. SecP 256K1. There's a whole bunch of different curves. Elliptic curve cryptography is named exactly that. There are these elliptic curves that graph out, and then the addresses come from points on that curve. That is just the name of a particular curve, right? And it's one that has been tested a lot. It's been used by governments and banks for encrypting data, securing data. So it's one that has been well approached The idea that there's, backdoors into it or that sort of thing has been thoroughly tested by people who actually are cryptographers. And it's, thought to be a very safe curve to use for elliptic curve cryptography.
And if I could just jump in real quick, I think it's important when someone says ECDSA to know that that is some of the cryptography that is securing Bitcoin, that's allowing us to use this. Do you need to know what an elliptic curve algorithm looks like and the chart and all of the math? No, definitely not, or I wouldn't be a CVP. But what you do need to know is that there is all of this math and technology behind that is doing all this secure cryptography. So people like Dirk, Rodney, Hunter, if you're more technical and are able to really look into the math in it, good for you. If you're not, it's okay. You can still use Bitcoin and understand how it works. What's important is just to know that there are all these mathematical and computational algorithms that exist, and they're being used in a way that we're kind of all benefiting from.
In the same way, you don't have to understand the cryptography behind HTTPS in order to be able to use a secure website, right? Yeah. There's all sorts of cryptography going on back there as well. Doesn't matter to you. What you have to know is just that that's what's making it secure so that somebody can't be stealing your money as it's along the way. So.
Yeah, Dirk, do you want to just real quick say a little bit about the CCSS since you're also on that committee?
Yeah, so I'll just throw a plug for that out there. One of the other things that C4 provides is the CCSS. That's the Cryptocurrency Security Standard. It's the oldest and only kind of openly developed standard for doing secure key management, specifically around blockchains and crypto. Yeah, you can go take a look at that through the C4 website as well. We actually have a whole nother certification in that where you do have to get pretty technical into understanding some of the stuff because you've got to be able to actually evaluate how it's being implemented. But if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go look at that as well. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about here in our abbreviations and acronyms is SHA-256, which is another mathematic algorithm. This one is a hashing algorithm. I think it was Jess was talking a little bit earlier about hashes. Hashes get used in, or maybe it was Rodney who was talking about them with the TXIDs. Hashes are one-way algorithms. It's something where it's very easy to do the math in one direction, but very hard to undo the math back in the other direction to find the source. And so they are used to validate stuff. And again, these get used in all over the place for validating bank transactions and all sorts of things like that as well. In the case of Bitcoin, they get used to validate the transactions themselves, as well as the blocks that go onto the blockchain. So the blocks on the blockchain, each time a new one gets added on, it includes a hash of the previous one, so that it makes it very difficult to go back and change those previous transactions. So you'll hear SEC P256 talked about. You'll hear SHA-256 talked about. Those are just the mathematical algorithms that, like Jess said, are being utilized to protect your Bitcoin on the blockchain.
And one of the things that Michael Perklin, our chairman of the board, actually said this example a long time ago to me, and it stuck, but it's what does a hashing algorithm really do? And if we're talking about a one-way hash, he explained it to me as, think about it like you have a piece of bread, you put it in the toaster, pops out, it's been toasted, it can't go back and be untoasted. You would know if someone was trying to untoast the toast. You can't. Once it's gone through the hash, once it's gone through the toaster, it is this new version. It's something new. It's a new function, or it's gone through the function, so it's something new. And I thought that was a helpful way to explain it. So yeah, we don't need to know about all the cryptography terms, but it is important to understand what is being used and how it's being used in kind of like a general way. Okay. So should we get into mining a little bit? Rico, I think Rodney, you were going to talk a little bit about what mining is and some of the terms around it, like POW and POS. And no, I'm not calling you that. So why don't we explain what those are?
You're all over it today, Jess.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you. Um, so you'll see this probably written more than you'll hear it spoken, which is capital P, small o, capital W, standing for proof of work. This is how the mining is done for the Bitcoin blockchain, mining being kind of the addition of new blocks, which mints new Bitcoin. It includes transactions, so kind of how the Bitcoin is moving, and how transactions are updated. So proof of work is basically a guessing game that's done by computers on a ridiculously large scale, to try and guess a encryption hash, which uses SHA-256, as Dirk mentioned, and basically they're trying to guess the hash, to kind of solve that block, and they change the difficulty and things like that throughout the life of the blockchain. I believe it's every 200 or 2016 blocks that it is looked at to make sure that we're sticking to kind of the roughly 10-minute time frame for each block to be mined, so that is constantly being updated. Another acronym you will see, again, probably more written than it is verbally used, for examples like Jessica kindly provided in reference to me at the beginning of this section, which is capital P, small o, capital S, which stands for proof of stake. This is done more on Bitcoin or a non-Bitcoin blockchains, where you're looking at more of a validator. And so certain wallets that hold a certain amount of the token on that blockchain will validate transactions. And so in that instance, instead of using the large amount of energy for Bitcoin mining, this is done on a smaller scale energy wise, where those validators kind of agree to the current stance of the blockchain for that particular token or platform or whatever you want to call it. And basically, you're using folks or companies or wallets, however you want to refer to it, that have a significant stake in that blockchain to monitor kind of the transactions being added to subsequent blocks, with the idea being that they're going to be incentivized to not want to do anything that's going to be problematic for that blockchain, as they hold a large position in it, which effectively is probably a large amount of money. So proof of stake is a common one. And when it comes to kind of the energy side of things and stuff like that, that's one that's talked about a lot because it does require far less energy. But there's debates on either side about the the downfall and the downside of things like that. And then the other acronym you're going to hear within the proof of work space. So as I said, there's a large amount of computational power being solved at solving the next Bitcoin blockchain, or next Bitcoin block, sorry. And the term used is ASIC. And an ASIC is a type of miner, and it was created around 2013, I believe, where it is an application specific integrated circuit. And what this is this is a little teeny tiny piece of hardware, and it is designed to make that miner only do one thing. So initially we had GPU mining, which was graphical processor unit, I believe, processing unit. And that's basically your video card. So your video card was being used to try and solve Bitcoin blocks. Once ASICs came out, they rendered that completely ineffective, just because it was so much more powerful. It could do so many more so much more analysis on it to try and,
yeah,
that's the word I'm looking for, thank you, to try and solve that block. So where where a graphics card can only do, say, 100, an ASIC can do like 100,000. And this is just general math. Don't quote me on any of that. It's just the ASIC can do exponentially more computations versus a video card. So that's where you're going to hear a lot of the term ASIC is specific within the proof of work mining space.
And I think this is an example of a term that it's good to know what it is and what it means. And it is part of our CBP exam, but I don't think in general conversations, you're going to be like at a crypto conference and someone's going to be like, what does ASIC stand for? And you're gonna be like, so it's one of those terms I think it's important to understand how it's being used and what, and for to become a CBP, yes, but I don't think that's something around the dinner table that people are criticizing people about for not knowing all of. But it is really important to understand that it is one of the most important pieces, because without these processing units, we wouldn't be able to have a Bitcoin network. We wouldn't be able to mine Bitcoin.
And I think that's kind of the point of this whole live stream, right? Is that you can just understand the big picture when people are talking, if they drop these, acronyms or abbreviations into conversation, right? You might hear somebody say something about like, the cost of ASICs, or the fact that ASICs drove like, individuals out of being able to participate in blockchain mining, or, you'll hear things mentioned, those sorts of things. You'll hear people talk about, like Rodney said, proof of work being, using more energy than proof of stake. And, but you have to understand what the value of that is as well. So the point of understanding all of these is so that when you're having a conversation, that they're not talking about the other POS, by which, of course, I mean point of sale system, Jess. Or
that's what I was talking about.
Right, totally. Or prisoners of war when you hear POW, or
Right.
that how these terms apply within the crypto industry.
Yeah, and I think so. We've got a lot more terms that we want to cover, but of course, everything with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, it's like unraveling the thread. Once you explain something, there's something else. So we have a lot more terms that we want to talk about, our acronyms and abbreviations, which we'll do in a further live stream. But before we close this out, I think it's really important to acknowledge that none of us know everything. Like even our CBP committee members still will, I'm sure, come across terms or hear things that you don't know. And that's okay. And it's also sometimes possible to hear a term, you don't know what it is. Maybe you're at a conference, you hear some random letters strewn together and you're like, oh God, I'm so far behind. I'm never going to pick up on this. And then you Google it and realize that those people didn't know what they were talking about. So I feel like it's really important to know that, yes, sometimes there'll be terms that are really technical or over your head, or you need to learn more about whatever, but there's also going to be cases where you don't actually need to know the term, or the person talking about the term doesn't know. And it's always okay to ask. Like it is always okay to say, hey, what were you just saying when you said POS? Like, I'm not sure I picked up on that. None of us are perfect. And I think that for the most part, Bitcoin is a really welcoming community. And if you find the right people, they're not going to like laugh you out of the room because you don't know what an ASIC is, because most people don't know what an ASIC is. And that's pretty normal and okay.
The
So
big part is like you have to start somewhere. Like you're not built or created with this terminology in your brain. This is all new, and so the expectation that you should just know this stuff is silly. It's been 11-ish years of constantly learning, and just when I think I'm doing really well, I talk to someone else, like a Michael or a Dirk or something like that, and realize like, oh, I've got so much more to go, which is exciting. It's not defeating. It's the other, like it's a constant evolution of information and ideas and things like that. So don't get upset about not knowing information, or to Jessica's point, getting something wrong. Like just take it as a chance to learn something and then be able to share it with something else. So the next time when someone else says something, you're like, I actually said that same thing 6 months ago, but what it actually is this thing. Now you've passed that favor on, and as long as that keeps perpetuating, then we'll be moving in the right direction.
As long as you don't go up to a Bitcoiner and say fiat's better, they'll be really friendly and help you understand whatever you need to know.
Or they'll think you're hilarious.
Well, this was super helpful. I mean, you know what? Even though I know all of these terms, going over them again and creating this list, like it helps refresh my memory. And I think it was useful. And I'm excited for our next live stream when we begin to go through the rest of them. And so far today, we covered history of money, Bitcoin basics, cryptography basics, mining, and then next time we want to talk about wallets, clients, key management, Bitcoin commerce, and then we're also going to do some like terms that you'll hear that aren't Bitcoin specific, but I think Hunter brought up HODL earlier, and I always say HODL. I think it is HODL, but I always pronounce it wrong in my head. But there are going to be some other terms that you'll hear floating around, which isn't just Bitcoin specific, but is crypto specific, and then also just financially specific, which I've caught myself in a few times thinking I understand this really cool term, and then it's like a traditional finance term that's been around for 100 years, and the only reason I didn't know about it is I wasn't in econ or finance major, and it's not just special for Bitcoin. So we'll cover some of those too. Anything else we think we should cover in the next stream?
Well, and Jessica, just to add to the point you're making, I think for me, it's one of the things that's fascinating about the general community. One is the point you and Rodney brought up, is that how welcoming and supportive the community is in general. And the other thing is that everything we've talked about was pre-existing before Bitcoin. But it was the unique combination of these existing technologies to put together this ecosystem. And so there are so many communities, so many lines of questioning and sort of, deep dives that people can go down when you find the thing that interests you. And it can be, you might be interested in going broad or going deep, but there'll be other people out there that will support you and help answer your questions as you're trying to sort of understand everything and navigate it. So I just echo what you had said before, is just be willing to ask what that is, why it's important, and you'll find somebody that will help you along.
Great. And we'll do the same when we meet you and you say something that, it goes back and forth. We'll be learning new things from the people who are watching this. It all kind of comes around in a circle. So thank you for joining. We'll see you for our next live stream, which will be a follow-up where we cover those next topics I addressed. And thank you for joining today. And thank you, Dirk, Rodney, and Hunter, for taking your time to teach about Bitcoin.